Hello everyone, my name is Taylor Mingo, and in this video I'll be helping you determine a firm's margin of safety, operating leverage, and finding their most profitable cost structure. Let's start off by talking about margin of safety. It can be defined as the excess of actual or expected sales over break-even sales, or in other words, how much can the company absorb without taking a loss. And it's important for managers to calculate a margin of safety because it shows them whether or not the company is at risk of operating in a loss. And they prefer to operate at a higher margin of safety because there tends to be less risk involved with that. So how do we calculate the margin of safety? Well, first of all, margin of safety can be expressed in either units or dollars or sales revenue. But to calculate margin of safety in units, you take the expected sales in units and subtract break-even sales in units from that. So for example, say we have a bookstore that's expected to sell 1,000 books this month, and they calculated that the break-even sales was 600 books. So we take the 600 and subtract that from 1,000, and we're left over with 400 books. And that is their margin of safety in units. The margin of safety in dollars can be calculated the same exact way. All you have to do is take the expected sales in dollars and subtract break-even sales in dollars from that. So in our example, we had 1,000 books that were expected to sell, so we multiply it by that sales price and subtract the break-even sales times that sales price as well. So then we get 15,000 minus 9,000 equals $6,000, and the $6,000 is our margin of safety in dollars. Now let's talk about operating leverage. Operating leverage refers to the relative amount of fixed and variable costs that make up its total cost. So a company with high operating leverage will have higher fixed costs and fewer variable costs, while lower operating leverage will have fewer fixed costs and more variable costs. Companies with a high operating leverage are more at risk because of their high fixed costs and lower variable costs. And if the sales volume declines, so does the income. To better understand operating leverage, we need to figure out the operating leverage factor, or how responsive a company's operating income is to changes in volume. As we talked about before, the greater the leverage, the greater the impact on sales. So, what's the equation for this? Well, operating leverage factor is found by taking the contribution margin and dividing that by the operating income. So here's an example of us calculating a high operating leverage factor. So the first thing we need to do is find the operating income. Now back in our example, we had 1,000 books and we sold it for $15 per book. So our contribution margin will end up being $15,000, and then we subtract our fixed expenses of $4,000 from that, and then we end up with an operating income of $11,000. We then divide our contribution margin by our operating income, and we end up with an operating leverage factor of 1.36. We then divide our contribution margin by our operating income, and we end up with an operating leverage factor of 1.36. Now if you're finding a low operating leverage with zero fixed expenses, you can just put a zero in where the $4,000 was in the operating income equation. So how does a company find which cost structure to use? Well, first of all, they need to find the indifference point, or the point at which there's no difference between the options. They can do this by setting the cost under option 1 equal to the cost under option 2. And the basic rule of thumb is, if the sales volume is lower than the indifference point, you should choose the lower operating leverage option. Or if sales volume is higher than the indifference point, choose the higher operating leverage option.